Hi everybody. Thank you so much for choosing to come to my talk when there's so many other awesome talks that are happening at the same time. I really appreciate it. As Maggie mentioned, I'm at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I'm actually in the very last semester of my PhD there. Thinking about pledging myself soon. Today what I'm going to talk to you about is some interesting things that we learned about swamp sparrows by studying their vocalizations, and particularly how they actually hear and perceive their vocalizations. Before I get into kind of the main research project, though, that's going to be the focus of my talk, I want to have a brief aside on some of the general uses that we might have for vocalizations in conservation, because I know a lot of you are conservation minded. And actually, vocalizations aren't one of the things that are kind of widely talked about in the rest of the symposium. One of the growing lines of research is actually technology that streamlines the collection and analysis of audio recordings from the field. And once you have those really big audio recordings, you can get lots of hours of data. And once you pull out like the number of different vocalizations you get and the different types of vocalizations and where you're finding these vocalizations, you can start to learn things about species richness, of like the number of different types of birds that you have in an area, and also the number potentially of birds of a single species that you have, so abundance, and maybe even things like the stage in the breeding cycle or other types of things. So I've done some work similar to this actually with rails in North Carolina as part of my master's research. And so one of the things that I did was put out these autonomous recording units. So they're just these fancy microphones. And I collected thousands of hours of data. And then I used a software program with a fancy algorithm to try to pull out where all of the king rail calls were in all of that data. And in doing so, we found that this is maybe a really useful alternative to actually having people going out to do callback surveys. Because this is going to actually reduce the amount of like people hours that we have outside doing this. And we can potentially get an idea of density from the number of calls that we get. So talk to me later if you want to hear more about rails. But what I also, which I also though want to talk about some other things that we can learn about vocalizations. And one of the things that's not necessarily talked about so much from a conservation perspective is actually the fact that if we do behavioral experiments, we might have some insights into things like how we should actually classify species. And so, for example, things like clumping and splitting are really important when we think about conservation policy. And I'm going to, for the rest of my talk, focus on this really fundamental behavioral question that we were asking about swamp sparrows, but I'll hopefully by the end help you understand how that might be related to conservation and have some strong implications there. So, and if you're a birder, which maybe many of you are in this room, you know that using vocalizations are really important when you're outside trying to figure out what bird you're hearing, or especially if you can't see it, that might be the only way that you can tell what bird is near you. And of course, the birds use their vocalizations too to figure out, based on what they're hearing, who they want to hang out with, who they want to mate with, and maybe who they want to chase off their territory. And what you might not know is that for passerine songbirds in particular, their vocalizations are really unique because they belong to this exclusive subset of only a few different types of animals that can learn to produce their vocalizations. So that means that just like human babies, these songbirds go through these stages where they start babbling and then they imitate adults and then they practice before they eventually get to their actual kind of polished adult songs. And interestingly enough, some of the foundational research that we have about songbird vocal learning comes from an area not too far from here. So really the study of bird vocalizations and songs took off in like the 50s and 60s after World War II, once we actually had technology to be able to make recordings of birds. And in the 70s, it really took off with Peter Marlick here and some of his colleagues who were working at the Rockefeller University Field Research Station, which is in Millbrook, New York. And one of the early studies from there that was really influential for my dissertation research was this 1977 paper that was published in the prestigious Journal of Science. So this is very well known, and it's called Selective Vocal Learning in a Sparrow. Now, one of the main methods of studying vocal learning at the time was to go out and find a nest of baby birds, bring those baby birds back into the lab, and then play them tape recordings of various different songs so that later you can see what they learn. And so what Peter and Susan did for this particular study is they went out and they brought in baby swamp sparrows, and then they played them an equal number of swamp sparrow songs and song sparrow songs without any cues as to which one they're like supposed to prefer, right? And they found that when these baby swamp sparrows got older and started singing, they only sang swamp sparrow songs. They didn't learn anything from the song sparrow songs. And so this was really showing that these birds have a strong predisposition to specifically learn songs of their own species. So that was really cool. But then I was curious, okay, so if learning is so important for these birds, and we know that birds don't start to actually sing until they're fledglings, until after they leave the nest, what if things that happen before that are also really important in cueing them in on which types of things they should learn? And how can we maybe figure out what is going on at that point? And so I was curious, does early experience, so specifically while these birds are still in the nest, do those experiences matter for their discrimination between different song types later? And so I turned to those swamp sparrows again. Now, I've been studying 2 of the 3 different subspecies of swamp sparrows. So up in Massachusetts, where I work, and all the areas shaded in blue, that's what we call the inland subspecies, because they specifically breed in these freshwater wetlands. And those inland birds have a more thin and pointed beak, and then a little bit more rufous plumage on the top of the head here. By contrast, the coastal subspecies only breeds down a little bit farther south, exclusively in the Chesapeake and Delaware Bay areas, and they're in these brackish tidal marshes. And so they have a slightly thicker beak and also a little bit more black on the top of their heads. And then most interestingly to me, the songs of these 2 different subspecies are slightly different from each other too. So first I'm going to play an inland song for you. Okay. So if you're not familiar with a swamp sparrow song, so it's this beautiful melodious trill, and that trill is made up of syllables. The syllables are made up of 2 to 5 different notes, so there's a lot happening in that one little song. And that syllable is then repeated the same exact way for about 2 seconds into that trill. For the inland songs, their syllables tend to have a few more notes than in coastal songs. And also, the inland songs span a wider range of frequencies. So the coastal and inland songs have about the same low frequency range, but inland songs reach some higher frequencies that the coastal songs don't get to. So now I'm going to play you a coastal song example. So you may not have noticed some of those differences that I just mentioned because they're really, really subtle to a human ear. But you may have noticed that that last song is actually two different trills kind of smushed together into one. And so this is a phenomenon we call a multi-phrase song. And that's pretty rare in general. So if you hear that happening, that's really lucky that you heard that. But those tend to be more common in the coastal population than they are in the inland population that you would have around here. So there's another difference. Now, so bringing this back to my research question, I was interested in finding out if baby swamp sparrows, while they're still in the nest, have experience with songs of the different subspecies, then how is that going to influence their ability to tell the difference between the two, if it is at all? And so I've been studying swamp sparrows in Western Massachusetts. So here is Amherst, where my university is. And I was at these two locations, the first being Lake Fitzgerald. So this is a lake that is surrounded by some marshy habitat. And then also on the Prescott Peninsula of the Quabbin Reservoir. And if there are any Bostonians in the room here, this is actually the main source of your drinking water. So that's where I was. There's a lot of marshy habitats around the Quabbin as well. And so we would go out and we would look for some swamp sparrow nests. And as it turns out, these nests are really, really hard to find because they are ground nesters. And so they have evolved to be really, really good at hiding their nests in plain sight. And so you can't actually even see where they are until you are directly over top of them. So where is the nest in this photo? You can't see where it is. It's right here though. And that's what it looks like. Here, we've got a nest in this clump of vegetation, and that's what it looks like. But you wouldn't be able to tell unless you go right up to it and kind of gently part the grass. But once we finally did find some nests, then instead of bringing those babies back into the lab, which they kind of tended to do in the olden days, we still played them songs, but we did that in the wild out in their natural habitat. And so what we did was these swamp sparrows fledge around 10 days old. So that's when they leave the nest. And we played songs for them between about 4 days old and 8 days old. And we played those from these battery-powered speakers that we put near the nest site. And those were only played intermittently, so as not to be super disturbing. And so we had these two different treatment groups. We either played them songs of the inland subspecies, which remember, that's the normal songs they would actually be hearing because that's the subspecies we have in this area. Or we played them songs of the coastal subspecies, which would be ones from that other population that breeds down farther south. And so after these 4 days of exposure, then we performed these behavioral tests where we asked them, okay, can you tell the difference between these two songs now? So we took those nestlings and put them in this funky colored pet carrier. And then we played them an inland song and a coastal song. And we just counted how many times they chirped in response to each of those two different song types. And then after they were done, we put them safely back in their nest. And so we initially predicted that we would have those nestlings chirping more in response to the songs that they had heard during training, but that didn't end up being what we found. So here you're going to see two different panels, and the panels separate the birds based on what they were trained with, so which of those two different playlists they heard. So on the left are the birds that were exposed to inland songs, so their own subspecies. And on the right are going to be the birds that were exposed to the coastal songs, so of the other subspecies. The x-axis here is the song that they were hearing during the behavioral trial. And then the y-axis is going to be how much were they chirping in response. And so first off, the inland exposed birds, you can see we're not actually telling the difference. They chirped the same amount in response to both of the different song types. And recall that, again, these birds were hearing just more of the local songs they would have been naturally hearing. And the very first time they ever heard a coastal song was actually during that behavioral trial. And they can't tell the difference. On the other hand, the birds that were trained with coastal songs, they are differentiating between the different songs. They're chirping more in response to the local songs. And recall that these birds would actually have been hearing both song types while they were in the nest, because they're hearing the coastal songs that we played for them, but also the natural songs from real birds that are singing around them from the inland subspecies. And so this really means that these coastal birds had to hear both song types to be able to learn the difference between the two. Whereas if you only had experience with one, you don't know that there's any difference at all. And so there were some other tests that we did for this particular study, but just from what I showed you so far, there's a few things I want to point out. So of course, this means first that swamp sparrows are able to discriminate between the different subspecies song types, and particularly that this can be learned really, really young before they even start to learn their songs. And we also saw that they needed experience with both song types in order to be able to distinguish between the two. Otherwise, they couldn't tell that there was any difference. And I would suggest that this means that nestling learning might actually speed up the process of species separation. So let me explain to you how this might work. So let's say you have two swamp sparrows, and there's one from each subspecies. Now, these two birds, given that they're mostly growing up around other birds of their own type, they probably haven't heard any songs of the other subspecies. So they might not be able to discriminate between the two different songs. So if they were to come together, they might think that that other bird is the same as them. And so they might mate with each other, but we don't necessarily know because they are so geographically separated from each other. They won't come into contact anyway. Whereas here, if we have two birds that are kind of on the border between where the two subspecies ranges meet, now these birds may have grown up hearing both song types. And so they may have learned how to distinguish between the two. And if they were to come together, they might think that that other bird is different from them. And so they probably won't mate with each other. So that means that here, where these birds are actually coming into contact with each other, then those birds aren't going to hybridize. There's not likely to be much genetic mixture between these two populations. And then they're going to continue to, over time, kind of diverge from each other. And so they're already kind of acting like separate species in this particular case. And so why is this potentially related to conservation? Well, we know that researchers, managers, conservationists like to talk about this idea of lumping and splitting, right? So how should we classify different species? And what types of factors should we use? Should we use morphology or genetics or behaviors? And my study suggests that maybe behaviors are something important that we should be considering when we think about how we should be classifying species. It's very possible that there are lots of other species out there of birds, just like swamp sparrows, where maybe we should consider splitting them because they're already kind of acting like separate species, even if they can still mate with each other. Now, learning of vocalizations also has a bunch of implications for some other conservation-related topics that I don't have time to go into today, like reintroductions, artificial incubation, and habitat fragmentation. Come chat with me later if you're curious about how those connections might happen. But to summarize what I've told you today, since I'm running out of time, I just want to hopefully remind you that we can learn some really cool things about birds by looking at vocalizations. And I also want to suggest that maybe we should consider looking at the vocalization behavior of particular species in order to make more informed conservation decisions. So with that, again, I want to thank Audubon and Charles for inviting me to come here. Also, all of the people, my field assistants in particular, who helped make this work possible, and sources of funding and field sites. So thank you for coming.